This is the Science Podcast for April 30th, 2026. I'm Sarah Crespi. First this week, we have a roundup of online news stories with editor David Grimm and staff writer Adrian Cho. After that, we have bioethicist Jackie Leak-Scully. She talks about how we should think about the ethics of epigenetics. This is marks on our DNA that change our gene regulation and can sometimes be passed down to the next generation. In the last segment, we are launching the 2026 book series. This is on science biographies. We picked 6. We're going to hear from books and culture editor Valerie Thompson and books host Angela Saini about how we chose what we covered. Okay, so we're going to talk about online news stories from the last week, maybe a little bit before that, with David Grimm, our online news editor. He's going to do the bulk of that work. But first, we have a special appearance from staff writer Adrian Cho. He specializes in physics, and he's going to walk us through one of the more difficult stories that we're going to tackle this week. It's on whether or not there are singularities at the center of black holes. So, hi, Adrian.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk about this because I know some of these words, like I know what a singularity is, I know what a black hole is, but I didn't know that it was a debate whether or not there would be one inside of the other.
The situation is that since the 1960s, physicists have known that if a star collapses to form a black hole, then according to the prevailing theory of gravity, which is Einstein's general theory of relativity, you have to form a singularity or something like it in space. And essentially what happens is the star gets smaller and smaller and smaller and denser and denser and denser, and the gravitational field it produces gets more and more intense. And that gravitational field is actually the warping of space-time. So time actually runs a little bit slower in a strong gravitational field. And so what actually happens is that when the star collapses to a point, you get this point of infinite stretching of space-time. If you go back to high school algebra, you remember the function 1 over x goes to infinity, right? That's kind of what's happening, right? Space gets infinitely stretched out.
For those of us who are visual/graphic learners, that's very helpful.
In the 60s, Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize, he proved that in general relativity, if a star collapses enough to form an event horizon, and that's a region where gravity is so strong that not even light can get out, then the star is fated to collapse to produce a singularity.
Okay, so just to remind, a singularity is this like infinitesimally small point where gravity and time kind of stop working appropriately in the singularity inside the center of the black hole. And so it's past the event horizon, which means we can't see it. We can only do math about it on the outside and say it's probably there or it's probably not there.
So the reason that's important is because general relativity does not work as you get to the singularity, which means what people have taken it to mean is that the theory is not complete and you need to come up with a theory of quantum gravity to explain it away, to get rid of it, because it's a little bit of nonsense in an otherwise workable theory. But the problem is that nobody knows how to combine quantum mechanics and gravity. So
there's this essential split in the theory of everything that physics is always trying to do. And quantum's on one side and general relativity is on the other side. And gravity is kind of this question mark. Why are we talking about this today? Why are you writing a story about whether or not there are black holes without singularities out there?
It turns out that 2 theorists have come up with an idea that says that you might actually be able to form black holes without singularities, or you might be able to get rid of the singularities in black holes without a full theory of quantum gravity. And they both came up with this idea that Hawking radiation, which is this not entirely quantum gravity effect, might actually be enough to prevent the singularity from forming. So you would get rid of this flaw in the theory, this unpredictability, without having to have a full quantum theory of gravity. So that's why we're talking about this.
Can you just remind everybody what Hawking radiation is?
We have this notion of things just fall in and the black hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what Hawking realized is that according to quantum theory, the vacuum of empty space has all these pairs of particles and antiparticles flitting in and out of existence too fast to be directly observed. And it turns out that you can do things like polarize the vacuum electrically because of the presence of these pairs. And what Hawking realizes, if this happens on the event horizon of a black hole, then one particle could get sucked in while the other one escapes, and essentially it looked like the black hole is radiating. And he actually argued that black holes will eventually evaporate this way. There's a reason why that's not actually realistically true.
But it might help because there's a theory and there's another theory that it might not be happening. So how is this ever going to get resolved? Like, I know we've been doing a little bit more observation of actual black holes because of gravitational wave detectors. We can see something about them, but what kind of observation or realization would resolve whether or not singularities are there or not?
This is a theoretical argument.
But I want the observations.
There isn't going to be an observation that solves this one.
No. Okay.
Not very likely, at least. The interesting thing is the way these folks figured out you could get around this is they actually looked at an even more complicated black hole, a so-called charged black hole, which has an electric charge. It actually turns out that a charged black hole has two event horizons. The good old ordinary one on the outside and one on the inside, where gravity switches from being attractive to being repulsive. And what they realized was that if you have Hawking radiation from the outside horizon irradiating the inside horizon, it can actually destabilize the inside horizon so that the two come back together and they basically merge and meet and cancel each other out. And all this happens before the singularity actually has a chance to form. So all that really happens is that it looks like a black hole for a long, 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 long time. And then it stops looking like a black hole and it blows up again.
That's interesting. Another undetectable through observation possibility. I just skimmed the Wikipedia page here. And, some people say that the universe started as a singularity. With this argument about singularities and black holes, are we kind of saying we don't need singularities at all to explain the universe?
Singularities aren't very useful. They're just places where the theory breaks down. So the fact that, the Big Bang is thought to be a singularity really just means that theorists can trace the evolution of the universe back ever so close to the moment of the Big Bang, but you're never going to get there, right? So there's not going to be a theory that tells you what actually happened.
So are singularities just a hole in the math and we just say there's one there and there's one there and there's one there?
More or less, yes, right? Because the assumption is that if you get a better theory, then it'll turn out that the singularity is not quite an infinity. It sort of rounds off and everything is good.
Super interesting.
The thing to keep in mind, the reason that singularities are bad in theoretical physics is it means your ability to predict things goes out the window because now you're dealing with infinities and you can't predict what's going to happen. That's why people don't like them.
Okay, Adrian, thanks so much for walking us through this. I'm really glad we had you guest spotting on our roundup of news.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
That was Adrian Cho. He's a staff writer for Science, here to help us understand black holes, singularity, gravity, general relativity, all that good stuff. Dave, thanks for sticking around through our very fun discussion of black holes. Now we're going to talk about some things from the biology side. Let's start with, this is very cool. This is spider heartbeats, which I think, first of all, we know spiders don't have hearts. They have something kind of analog.
They have
right?
an analog. They have they don't have a heart like we have a heart. They have this sort of
dorsal vessel,
single tube shaped thing that is sort of located in the upper part of their abdomen where we might expect a heart to beat. But it pumps their fluid, their hemolymph, which is sort of their equivalent of blood, through their circulatory system, which is also different than ours. But for all intents and purposes, they do have a heart-like structure.
They have a heart rate too. That's kind of what got us, everyone interested in this story, is that there's video of this vessel pumping. And it's, of course, orb weavers, which are kind of the pretty spiders, if you think any kind of spiders.
Yes, they make pretty fantastic webs as well, yeah.
And their bodies have color and pattern. And so if you look at their dorsal vessel pumping, it's very cool looking. Why are researchers filming the dorsal vessel of orb weavers?
And this is certainly true of me living in a big city like New York. I mean, the city can it's overwhelming and kind of stress you out. A lot of noise, a lot of air pollution, traffic, things like that. And we know that can sort of have an impact not just on people, but on animals. Usually people are thinking about vertebrates, but this is an interesting study because it's looking at invertebrates, which is a really understudied type of animal we're talking about their responses to sort of noise pollution and urban environments.
What happens to a spider that is in a noisy situation? Like, what happens with their heart rate?
Researchers looked at two types of orb weaving spiders. They looked at the golden silk spider and the Joro spider. This is an invasive spider that's actually been spreading pretty rapidly across the southeastern United States. And they captured females of both species, brought them back to the lab, and then they broadcast 10 minutes of synthesized traffic noise. I'd kind of love to hear what it sounds like. We unfortunately don't have a clip of that.
Maybe I would find it relaxing because I live in the country.
Maybe you would. Maybe you would. Maybe it'd be like birdsong to you. But then they look at the spider hearts, and you can't see on the site. This really, which kind of blew me away because I never thought with the naked eye you could see a spider heart beating, but that's what you're seeing in these videos. And they found that the kind of counterintuitively, the Joro spiders, which were collected from these noisy roadsides, actually had the strongest spikes in heart rate in response to the traffic versus the golden silk spiders, which were not necessarily raised by noisy roadsides. They didn't show as much of a spike. And this could be because the Joro spiders, maybe because they already know what traffic noise is and maybe that it's scary or whatever, they're more sensitized to it. And so you can actually see them having a much, much more dramatic response to this noise.
And as you said, like the effect of noise pollution on invertebrates is pretty understudied, but they do care about sound. All these different insects make noise to each other and they can be drowned out, or they can not find their mates if it's really noisy. Or this is kind of just the beginning. We don't know what the impact of having a faster heart rate is on the spiders.
We don't. I actually posted this story on Blue Sky a few days ago, and somebody responded and said something to the effect of like being incredibly sad about this because it, just going to show that all the things we do have this huge impact on the animals that live around us. And, showing that this does have an impact on spiders really shows that this stuff has like a really wide ranging. It's not just birds and other animals that we're sort of used to seeing, but a lot of animals we're not used to seeing or thinking about may also be having a dramatic response to sort of our urban lifestyle.
All right, one more story, Dave. This one is on building a house to help people lower the incidence of disease. This is very cool. And as Kai Cooper-Schmidt wrote this, pointed out that it's not every day that you get to do a randomized control trial where you build people houses.
Right. We're always thinking about, we think about controlled trials. We're thinking about maybe one group's taking a pill, and the other group's not taking a pill, or one group's doing exercise or dietary intervention, the other group's not. And this is the first time I've seen this too, where like one group is living in a particular type of house, and the other group is living in a very different type of house.
And so they built 110 houses for this study in southern Tanzania. What's different? What makes them healthier for the inhabitants?
Well, a lot of the inhabitants in this part of the world live in these very simple mud and thatch houses. And these new houses that the researchers built were still fairly simple houses. They're small 2-story houses. They have a concrete base, they have a steel frame, and also, really more importantly, they have these screen facades that let air in but keep insects out. They have bedrooms on the top floor, and mosquitoes mostly tend to stay close to the ground. They have these outdoor bathrooms, and that's important if you're concerned about potential disease transmission through waste. So they have all of these fairly simple but theoretically important modifications that you wouldn't find in a much simpler mud and thatch home that's much more common in this community.
As Kai wrote, people were randomized to these houses.
Right. There's a lottery to determine who got these sort of quote unquote fancy homes.
Not a smooth process.
Not a smooth process. And I think that was sort of an unanticipated part of the methodology, is that all of a sudden you had this sort of envy developing because like, some people in this community are getting these relatively fancy houses, and there was a lot of distrust, and there was these false stories starting to be told about hidden rooms within these fancy houses. And the researchers actually had to go in because what they found was that the people who won the lottery were often not staying in these houses because there was this stigma. So they had to go in and they organized these soccer matches in the community so people started to trust them. And they finally were able to get people to move into these homes and able to collect some valuable data.
What do they find was different about, I think they looked over multiple years. What do they find for people who got moved into these newer homes?
They looked over a 3-year period, and they found that children under 13 years old that were living in what they called these star homes, and these were the relatively fancy homes, were 44% less likely to suffer from malaria, Diarrhea was also way down in the people that lived in these homes. Also, fewer instances of respiratory infection. So overall, they found these fairly dramatic health benefits.
Those are all killer diseases, not in every case, but they do contribute significantly to mortality
100%.
all over the world. It's impressive that they were able to bring these numbers down in young children. There are interventions that are cheaper than building. This is an expensive way to intervene to prevent disease.
Right. It cost them, I think, about $8,800 per house. And that's just way outside the budget of the people living here. And some of the criticisms are, it's hard to even get donors to pay for like nets that cost $1.20, And so it's like now we're talking about an $8,800 house. And even the researchers say that while the houses themselves may not be financially realistic, that the types of interventions that the houses have, principles like these netted openings, or maybe trying to sleep on an upper floor if that's possible, these are things that could potentially be extrapolated from the study without actually having to build these houses in every case.
All right, Dave, thanks so much for talking me through those stories. Do you want to mention anything else to look out for on the site this week?
The secret behind the penguin's waddle, scorpions arming up. This is scorpions actually incorporating metal into their stingers and their claws to make themselves even more dangerous. And another one of Adrian's stories, this is a story about how gravity follows Newton's and Einstein's laws, even at the largest structures in the universe. So big breadth of things happening on the site.
More to learn there.
Yes,
yeah. All right. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
David Grimm is the online news editor for Science. You can find links to the stories we discussed at science.org/podcast.
Kayak gets my flight, hotel, and rental car right, so I can tune out travel advice that's just plain wrong.
Bro, Skycoin. Way better than points.
Never fly during a Scorpio full moon.
Just tell the manager you'll sue. Instant room upgrade.
Stop taking bad travel advice. Start comparing hundreds of sites with Kayak and get your trip right. Kayak. Got that right.
Now at McDonald's, a McDouble is $2.50, so you can get your gym gains on, or just get lunch for only $2.50. Get more value on the under $3 menu.
Limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Prices may be higher for delivery.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Also out this week, we have in the news section something by staff writer Jenny Smith. She covers a study on giving C-section babies the benefits of the vaginal microbiome. Interestingly, the study shows that infant skin is the primary place for the microbes to work their magic, not the gut. In the journals this week, there's a paper out in Science Advances by Christine Johnson and colleagues about using robotic vision and AI transcription to digitize labels from natural history collections. They found the system was 30 times more efficient than manually inputting that label information, suggesting we can leap ahead in getting our natural history collections online. Stay tuned for a chat with bioethicist Jackie Leach Scully on the ethical conundrums that come with understanding epigenetic inheritance. This week in science, Jackie Leach Scully wrote an Expert Voices column on epigenetics and health with a particular focus on ethics. Hi, Jackie. Welcome to the Science Podcast.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Yeah. So for our audience, can you just give us a brief summary of what epigenetics is?
Fundamentally, it's about how gene expression is controlled. And it's expanded to cover a range of ideas about gene expression within an individual, but also potentially within that individual's offspring as well. There are some scientists who are interested in epigenetics in terms of how genes are switched on and off in an organism's development and in the course of its life in response to various stimuli. There are other scientists who are interested in whether the regulation of certain genes can, in fact, be transmitted through the gametes to that individual's subsequent generations.
Right. So kind of in the pop science world right now, when people talk about epigenetics, it's usually in this relation to the heritability aspect. If you're experiencing, say, PTSD and that is somehow marked onto your DNA in your gametes, so you pass it on to your offspring. Now, I'm not really sure how much science is backing that up at this point, but we do know in animal models that you can treat an animal in a specific way, like with a drug or with a toxin, and see results of that in the marks on the DNA or on the regulation of DNA 1, 2 more generations down.
Yeah, that's right. It's mostly in animal models because there are lots of different steps to this, obviously, and ethically as well as practically because of the length of generations. It's very difficult to do this in humans. What you want to be showing, for example, is that an external toxin of some kind both causes chemical modification of the DNA. You want to show that those modifications are related to something that happens to that individual's health. And if you're interested in the heritability aspect, you want to see that those epigenetic marks are in some way transmitted to the offspring and that they then go on to have effects on the phenotype of the offspring as well.
Right. But to bring it down to the really basic, it's the idea that what happens to you in your life behaviorally, experience in the environment can alter you and your health, but it can also alter the health of your offspring without mutating your DNA, right? Without actually changing the bases in your DNA. There's other things that can be passed down. So what is kind of the ethical angle here? Like, why is it something that people need to think about as we learn more about this epigenetics and the heritability and health?
The ethics of it, I think, is quite complex because, in a way, the positive idea behind epigenetics is that you're not doomed by your genome in a way. One might have thought in the past that, okay, the genes that you're born with are going to be active. They're the ones that you're stuck with for the rest of your life. Is they're going to cause some kind of health issue? Well, that's just too bad. The best you can do is sort of surveillance to try to nip health problems in the bud and so on. What epigenetics introduces as a potential idea is that it would be possible to modify the regulation of the genes that you're born with and do so in a flexible way. So potentially, and this is just an idea at the moment, if you were born with some gene variant that was going to cause you health issues later down the line, you might be able to tweak that by switching it on or off using epigenetic modifications like methylation of the DNA and so on. That's actually in some ways, a very positive idea. What it also introduces, however, is the potential for apportioning responsibility and blame in ways that haven't previously been done. It's really hard to blame one's parents for one's genetic heritage.
In most cases, yeah.
Yeah. People can do it, but it's actually not reasonable to do that because the parents had no control over their genetic heritage and therefore over what they passed on to you. In terms of epigenetics, you might turn around to your parents and say, well, you were indulging in behaviors like smoking or substance abuse or having a terrible diet and that kind of thing that had epigenetic effects on your genome and on your gametes and that then had epigenetic effects on me. Basically, that was your fault. You knew all about it. You had the choice not to do those things, and yet you went ahead and did them.
Yeah, kind of expanding out from this idea that smoking during pregnancy is not recommended, but now it's any point in your life that can be inherited because of epigenetic effects. It's not a literal thing that we know will happen, but it is where the ethics start to pick up here with epigenetics.
Yeah, I think that issue is a real one, partly because traditionally, women have always been afforded more responsibility / blame for the health of their fetus and their children. This could give potentially a scientific or quasi-scientific backing to that. And even quasi-science or pseudoscience tends to slip into popular attitudes and very often into policy, rightly or wrongly. So you could foresee a situation in which a woman who, smokes or drinks or is obese or even, fails to lie down and listen to Mozart on the headphones for 2 hours every afternoon while she's pregnant, to ease the stress. Women who do that kind of thing can be blamed or even prevented from doing it for the sake of the fetus if there was a scientific backing to the idea that they were consciously either harming their fetus or at least failing to protect their fetus.
A lot of what happens to us and our epigenomes is probably beyond our control, whether it's environmental toxins or just stuff we don't really understand at this point. What's the ethical implication of a more thorough understanding of that aspect of epigenetics? You do talk about this kind of feedback loop where a person who is exposed to, say, trauma or stress or bad conditions, and then they have kids, and then those kids are going to have, there's going to be this expectation on the children that they might have illnesses or not be as fit for, the world.
Yeah. You could imagine a situation in which, either because there's a population that has been exposed to industrial pollutants or something like that, or else they have a history of oppression through, colonization or history of slavery or
famine or war or, there's all kinds of stuff, right?
And coming down to things like violence in the local environment, even. It doesn't have to be large-scale war. You can imagine situations in which those populations are identified. And again, ideally, you would hope that the response would be, well, maybe they have some kind of epigenetic damage. Maybe there would be a way of modifying the environment so that this doesn't happen, or perhaps they require more resources in order to get over the kind of disadvantage that they may experience because of this. You can also, unfortunately, envisage a response in which the state or society thinks, well, they're pretty doomed anyway. Why should I intervene in a child prenatally, perhaps, or within the first 2 years of its life, if it's going to stay in that environment where it's going to be exposed to all these terrible, potentially epigenetic effects anyway? So perhaps we can just write them off and place our resources elsewhere. That's not the approach that I'd be recommending. I hope that's clear. But you can imagine that one happening.
Kind of going towards the positive side. We're talking a lot about, okay, well, we can better understand the epigenome. We can better understand what makes marks. We can better understand what the influence of those marks or the gene regulation is on a person or their offspring. What about reversing that? Do you see that as an opportunity for bringing resilience to communities or to curing health problems as we better understand epigenetics?
Potentially, but it's a very, very long way down the line. Earlier on in the conversation, we kind of elided factors like diet, environmental toxins, and then straight on to sort of stress, PTSD, trauma, and so on. There's some evidence at the diet and toxin end of that for effects on humans, better in animal models, and we extrapolate from that, but not much for humans. There's very little actual reliable evidence for the other end of the scale, the transgenerational response to historical trauma and so on. Nevertheless, it's a narrative that I think is very appealing to people because it's one that makes sense as their personal experience. And that's something that often happens with science, that a version of it is useful in making sense of our lives. The danger with that one is, as I say, taking it for a kind of scientific validity that it doesn't yet have. And also, I think that there is a bit of a technologization that can go along with that we immediately begin to think in terms of, let's do some kind of pharmaceutical intervention that will knock off all those methylations and so on, remove the epigenetic markers, and we'll solve the problem. When I won't say that the simpler thing to do would be get rid of the environmental toxins, because it's not a simple thing, but it might conceivably be a better approach than giving people some pills to get rid of the damage because of the exposure that they've suffered.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was once a scientist, and I do find epigenetics a fascinating area. As an ethicist, I get a little bit concerned that the ideas of what we can do with it are running ahead of the reality. And that is realistically being seen in some of the popular media information that's going to expectant families, particularly women, about what they ought to be doing during their pregnancies and otherwise. And I think we place women and pregnant women under an enormous amount of pressure already. They don't need additional ones to be sitting there worrying about trying to get their heads around what epigenetics is and what they ought to be doing to modify their epigenetic constitution.
Jackie, thanks so much for talking with me.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Jackie Leach-Scully is a professor of bioethics and director of the Disability Innovation Institute at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. You can find a link to the paper we discussed at science.org/podcast. Don't touch that dial. Up next, we hear about the difficulties of picking science biographies for our 2026 book series, and of course, the joys of finding the right one. This month, we're kicking off our book series for 2026. How do you feel about science biographies? When I was first talking with Books host Angela Saini and Books editor Valerie Thompson, we were planning this year's lineup, and we were all surprisingly pretty mixed on how we felt about biographies and autobiographies. It was kind of a surprise because I thought I was the only one dreading it. But, I'm going to just spoil it right now and say we all got turned around, but we actually did fund books to put on the lineup. So that's what's next. We're going to hear a rundown of what's coming up this year with Valerie and Angela. But first, we'll start with why we were all a little ambivalent about science biographies to start with.
This is a tricky year for me because I'm kind of a biography hater. And we were like talking about what we're going to do this year. And I was like, oh, just like a good scientific biography is really good. Like it's going to introduce you to this field in an incredibly personal way. It's going to be unlike anything you encounter in a textbook. But the bad ones are just so bad. And it's nothing to do with like scientific biographies specifically. It's just like, when you get close to a subject, you're just inclined to tell their story maybe a little bit differently than it should be told. And so the good ones are good, but the bad ones are very bad. Thankfully, we've only selected good ones for this series.
Yeah, I think we do have a good lineup. And I agree with you that when people are writing about other people or when they're writing about themselves, there is this inclination. And this is why I don't read that many biographies, actually. And I was looking forward to this year just because it would give me an opportunity to do that. But I find that autobiographers and biographers have in their mind an idea of what they think about that person or about themselves, and they're managing it at the same time as they're writing. So to find a really warts and all, everything is out there displayed kind of book is really difficult. There's a bit of friction for me as a reader. I'm wondering, what is it that you want me to think about this person? Allow me to think it for myself. And that's what I find difficult about biographies sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes the stories, they're just like the tendency is to make them a little too tidy. And as a reader, it's so transparent when that's the case. And it's not something that's very interesting then.
No, and everyone is complicated. Everyone has good light and dark bits of their personality. And I want all of that. And sometimes I feel those bits are held back a little bit.
For this series, we were looking at not only what subjects can we feature, but kind of what do different biographies say and kind of what do they do? So they do more than just tell the person's story. They can talk about how legacies are established and maintained. They can talk about how do we render, like we were just saying, the complexities of people in a way that is believable and interesting. How do we make meaning from the challenges that we face, and how do we tell stories about ourselves? That was kind of what we were thinking about as we came together to think about this series.
The first book kind of sums that up really neatly because it's Anna Luna Post's book, Galileo's Fame, which is about how Galileo became famous and why that was so important to the way that we remember him today, which is an interesting approach to writing biography, but I thought hugely successful. I really loved this book so much.
I thought so too. And especially you just think about who could be more famous than Galileo, but what this book does is kind of shows that reputation was something that was very carefully cultivated. It was cultivated by him. It was cultivated by certain people who had different stakes in his research and in his success. It was something that showed what it's like to build a scientific legacy in real time. And then, this is obviously one that lasted for quite a long time.
I had no idea about this before I started reading the book, but Galileo had a lot of difficulties in his life, including allegations of plagiarism against him. And one of the nice things about writing about somebody who is long gone, very, very long gone, even his ancestors, I don't know how many of them are still around, but it means that you can put it all in there. You don't have to worry about what anybody thinks. And that, for me, was so enlightening because it gave me this textured sense of what it must have been like living in the 17th century, trying to conduct science with all these other pressures going on in the world, and actually weirdly very relevant to modern day scientists, I found.
The next one that we are going to feature is a book called Dorothy Hodgkin: A Life. This is about a more contemporaneous scientist. So this is by journalist Georgina Ferry. We kind of wanted to look at this question of how does a biographer decide what to include and what to discard? And we can do that in this case because Ferry actually wrote this book in 1998. It became the definitive biography of Hodgkin, but then she issued a completely revised and updated copy in 2020. And so for me, I'm really interested in kind of learning what were the differences between those 2 years. and how do they reflect kind of a difference in her understanding of Hodgkin during that period?
For me, this was the very first biography I ever read, because in 1998, I was in my final year of high school and I was planning to go and do engineering at university. One of the senior people at the school, I think he may have been a governor, he wasn't a teacher, but a governor, gave me a copy of the book to inspire me when I went to do engineering, because there were very few girls at that time. In fact, there are very few girls even now who went into engineering. So I remember it. I think of this book very fondly. So I'm reading the updated edition now. And like you, I'm also really intrigued about what new stuff is in there.
Well, I would be kind of interested then to hear kind of how things changed for you, like upon your first reading versus this reading, you know what I mean?
If I can remember it, that was a long time ago. I don't fully remember it. It made a huge splash when it came out. I remember it was a very important book when it came out, and not least because, you know, it seems so common to us now to have biographies of women scientists, but that has taken a while to happen. And there's only a few characters, Marie Curie among them, who we really remember in scientific history. And especially in the 90s, there just wasn't very much. So I think Georgina Ferry's book was incredibly important at the time.
Yeah, something that I've observed is that often there'll be biographies and it'll be like, this is a biography about this specific male scientist. And then it'll be like, here's a book about 50 female scientists. And it's just like little blurbs about each of them. And it's like each of these people deserve their own story as well.
And speaking of male scientists, the third book on our list is Frick by Matthew Cobb, which is also a doorstopper of a book. It's a huge book and equally fascinating because, of course, we remember Crick and Watson for their discovery of the structure of DNA, but a very important figure in their life, of course, was Rosalind Franklin, who contributed hugely to that work, but wasn't celebrated in quite the same way. It's a very interesting book to read for that reason.
Francis Crick undoubtedly made enormous contributions to science. And he was also this complex person. And there are some things about him that we don't celebrate as much. People are complex and we need to keep that in mind, and telling their stories. That's like one of the challenges that a biographer faces is how to tell stories like that.
Absolutely. And, you know, I had completely forgotten this when we put the book on the list, but I'd spoken to Matthew Cobb, the author, at a workshop a couple of years ago when he was still working on the book. And he was talking to me about the challenges of writing about Crick's sexual assaults, which have been documented before, his treatment of women. I hadn't remembered that conversation until he brought it up, but I'd been pressing him to address that and really confront it. There is this view, I think, still within the sciences, even though it doesn't exist in other disciplines, that people's work can be treated separately from their behavior or their personality, which I deeply disagree with, because I do think that how you behave in a lab and how you treat other people then has a direct impact on what that lab looks like, the kind of work that it does, who's allowed to do science and who isn't. So I think they're all intertwined. And I remember we had that conversation, and it will come up, I think, when that episode is aired.
Our next book is about another famous figure. So this is a book about the geneticist M.S. Swaminathan. He was renowned. He was the main architect of India's Green Revolution. The challenge for this biographer is what more can be said about this larger-than-life figure. He's written about very widely. What more are we going to learn from this story?
I actually met M.S. Swaminathan when I was writing my very first book about Indian science, and he is a larger-than-life figure. He was famous within his own lifetime and hugely celebrated in India for understandable reasons, because he really helped spur the Green Revolution, which saved people from famine and hunger, and the impact is still felt today. So I haven't read this book yet. I'm so intrigued to read it and so excited to read it, because I do want to know the ins and outs of his life, the personality behind those big achievements. So the author of this M.S. Swaminathan book, Prembada Jayakumar, I think this is a difficult thing to write, because when you're writing about someone who only very recently passed away, but is such a huge, titanic figure in Indian science and in Indian agriculture, I think. And India is still an agricultural country. I think people forget that because we have this vision of this up-and-coming scientific superpower, but the majority of people in the nation still work in agriculture, have small holdings. For Jayakumar, I think this is a hugely important biography, because everybody will be reading it so closely.
Right. And kind of how do you do justice to such a revered figure and also show their more human side? That's the part that I'm kind of interested in learning more about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next book on the list is The Smallest Lights in the Universe by astrophysicist Sarah Seeger. This is our first autobiography, which again, for me, it's really hard to tell other people's stories. It's really even more difficult. I mean, we spend our lives telling stories about ourselves. Whether or not they're true and whether or not they're interesting stories are kind of separate questions. I think in this case, certainly the story that Seeger is able to tell about herself is interesting and it's well told. She is an exoplanet researcher, but her story is also about becoming a young widow. She was widowed at the age of 40. And so she kind of is able to look at how these various identities intersect, how we make meaning from the things that we face, and kind of how we tell our stories. And this is, in her case, to herself and to other people.
What I really love about this book is that it's the day-to-day struggle of trying to do science while managing a family. And in her case, obviously under such tragic circumstances on her own, and the help that she was given to allow her to continue her career. And I think this is incredibly important, especially to think about women in science, because I think women still have this pressure on them to take on the majority of care work at home. And that ends careers. That's part of the pipeline problem that we have within the sciences. But Seeger, thankfully, because she is such a brilliant scientist, was given that support. And that allowed her to continue her career. And I think that's inspirational, but also a lesson for institutions.
Well, I also think it will be very helpful for readers to kind of understand behind the scenes, how are people with families making their careers work. And this is an articulation of that I think will be very useful.
And then we have another autobiography for our final pick, Spawning Season by Joe Osmundson, which I haven't read yet. It actually comes out in May, but I'm hugely excited about because, again, this looks at the family. You know, how do you think about the family, but from a completely different perspective, which is queer families. How do we think about families in the 21st century where we don't have this rigid 1950s model anymore, that we can be more expansive about it? I'm very intrigued to read this one.
I think this one is really interesting too, because we are talking about how do people's scientific legacies, how do we create those? How do we want to be remembered as researchers or scientists? But in some cases, well, in all cases, being a scientist is just part of your identity. Osmundson is a biophysicist, but this story is more about his lifelong desire to become a parent. It's not really about his science. And so it's kind of, in addition to being a really interesting story and a really important one, it's a nice reminder for readers to remember that scientists have interests and aspirations that extend beyond the laboratory.
And it does make a difference also, again, to how science is done, because it makes you think differently about the world. You know, when you have a more expansive understanding of gender, then you also bring that understanding to biology and to questions of human difference, which matters.
And the reverse applies too. Like, even though this isn't a story about his own research or his own scientific work, he has certain training that brings this mindset that maybe a non-scientist wouldn't have. And so it's all bound up in this one very interesting story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I do think we have a really good range this year in terms of the breadth of different, not just the people who are being written about, but the people who are writing them. And I'm very grateful that we picked biographies as a theme this year. I know you read a lot of biographies as a book editor, but I really don't get to read that many. And I feel that it's just opened up a whole new genre to me. And I'm going to read more, I think, after this.
You know what? This has changed my attitude too. I used to be a real biography hater, but this has turned me around. I'm on board now.
That's something. That's great.
That was Science, Books, and Culture editor Valerie Thompson and Books host Angela Saini. At the end of next month, we'll hear about the first in our biography series, Galileo's Fame, Science, Credibility, and Memory in the 17th Century by Anna Luna Post. That concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write to us at sciencepodcast@aaas.org, or you can find us on the apps and make a comment there. To find us on podcasting apps, search for Science Magazine or listen on our website, science.org/podcast. This show was edited by me, Sarah Crespi, and Kevin McLean. We had production help from Podigy. Our music is by Jeffrey Cook and Wen Koi Wen. On behalf of Science and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us.
You can't reason with the sun. Trust us, we've tried. This summer, it's time to put that angry ball of fire on mute. Columbia's Omni-Shade technology is engineered to protect you from the sun's harsh rays that can burn and damage your skin. The sun is relentless, but so is our gear. Level up your summer at Columbia.com to spend more time outside and less time slathering on aloe lotion. You're welcome. Columbia, engineered for whatever.